I spent a month living in Bali, but there are some things that I wish I had known before visiting, so I'm going to share all that with you today. So we're going to cover a few different things. First, I'm going to tell you about a couple apps you're probably going to want to download that will just make your life a little bit easier. I'm going to talk about how to actually get around the island, including some really important scooter tips. I'm going to talk about some things to look out for when you're booking accommodation. I'm going to talk about some general tips, including some important safety things. I'm going to tell you about a few things that you're probably going to want to pack because you might have a hard time finding them in Bali. And I'm going to tell you about some of the biggest mistakes that I see tourists make. That way you don't make them yourself. So let's talk about some of those apps that are going to make life a little bit easier. And the first one is an app called Klook. And by the way, none of what I'm about to talk about is sponsored in any way. Nothing in this video is. But what Klook will allow you to do is book a driver in advance. It's somebody who's going to be waiting there at the airport, so you don't have to stress about anything when you first arrive in Bali. You don't just use Klook in the airport transfers. You can also use them for day trips and getting around the island. So it's a great resource that I'd highly recommend using. It's pretty cheap as well. I was staying in the Canggu area, and from the airport, it only costs about $7-8 for that ride. So great option there. The next app that you're going to want to know about is Gojek and Grab. These are two kind of interchangeable apps. These ones think more about like an Uber, also delivery service with Gojek. So they're going to be your bread and butter most of the time. The next app that I found myself using quite often in Bali was WhatsApp. And I was primarily using this to communicate with businesses. That's really how you're going to interact with restaurant reservations, interacting with the business to ask about open hours, rates, things like that. So definitely make sure you have WhatsApp ready to go. And the last app that I found myself using quite a bit was actually Instagram, but not for the reason you think. I found that a lot of restaurants, they were trying to create promotions and get people in the door, and they wanted to grow their brand. So when you're in the restaurant, I found that a lot of them were saying, hey, we'll give you 10, maybe 20% off your meal if you go follow our Instagram, maybe interact with this post, do something there. So if you're looking to maybe save a couple bucks, be ready with that Instagram. It might come in handy. Now, let's talk about some ways to get around the island, because yes, you can always use all of those apps. They're great options, but there are a few other ways. So the first thing that's important to note is that you technically can walk, but in most of the tourist hotspots like Canggu, walking is kind of tough. It's a little bit dangerous, and just don't expect there to be good infrastructure for it. So because of that, most people end up renting scooters, and they're great options, but there's a lot of really important things to note. And the first thing to note is that you are going to need an international driver's permit. This is a requirement by the Indonesian government, and it looks something like this, at least if it's coming from the US. Every country is going to be a little bit different, but for me, I just went to my local AAA. I picked this up in about 10-15 minutes. It cost like 20 bucks, and that was all I needed. But the next thing to know is that when you do go and pick up the rental scooter from wherever you're getting it from, it's probably going to be pretty important to ask them, hey, can I take this thing for a test drive for a couple of reasons. One, yeah, you want to make sure that the scooter is working well, but if you're anything like me and you hadn't been on one of these things, you're like, hey, don't turn me loose to these streets. These streets are a bit crazy. So I asked my guy, hey, I've never ridden one of these things. Can you show me how it works? Can I test this out a little bit? And he took me to a parking lot where there were no people. He showed me how everything worked, got me comfortable, and that was really, really important. Definitely make sure you feel comfortable before hitting the streets. Things are dangerous. Do be careful. And the next tip around that is make sure to rent the helmet. Don't be one of the dummies that is riding around without a helmet. I see so many people get in accidents. So make sure you have the helmet. But another tip with the helmet is make sure that there's a visor. The visors are sometimes tinted and other times they're clear. Don't make the mistake that I made, which was the tinted visor. Here's why that's a bad idea. I once went up to like one of these temples to see the beautiful sunset, which meant I had a pretty sizable drive back in the dark. Well, the problem was the tinted thing was too dark, and I literally could not see out of it. I had to lift the visor, which meant I was just getting blasted in the face the whole time by bugs. It was a terrible experience. It was really dangerous, stupid, and it all could have been avoided with just taking the clear visor. So if you get that option, definitely take the clear one. But the next really important thing to know around transportation is that you should expect delays because traffic can get really, really bad. Next thing to know is that if you do need to fill up your scooter with gas, you're probably looking around saying, wait, where are the gas stations? And sometimes sometimes there aren't. Instead, there are these little stands on the side of the road that you might miss if you don't know what you're looking for. So be on the lookout for these things, but also note that there will be an attendant. They will be running the show. They'll help you fill up, and they all accept cash. So make sure you have some cash on hand for that. But when you're driving around the scooters, a lot of people make the mistake of using Google Maps and actually just like the regular driving directions, but it can be helpful to actually switch to the walking directions. And if you're saying, wait, why would I pick walking if I'm driving on a scooter? Well, that's because, again, infrastructure isn't great. Google Maps isn't totally up to date. So oftentimes it's actually walking paths are the quickest routes, but everybody's just riding scooters on them. So Google just doesn't quite know the difference. So make sure you keep that in mind. One last really important scooter safety tip is I see a lot of people make the mistake of not wearing shoes with traction. And when you're coming to a stop, you kind of end up like walking on the streets or like having your feet touch the surface of the road. So it's going to be really important to have that traction to make sure that you can safely come to a stop and navigate things. But let's talk about two important things to ask your accommodation place before actually booking. So I made a mistake here. The first one is ask if there's any construction going on nearby. I made the mistake of that, and turns out right behind the apartment that I booked, there was a huge building being constructed the entire time, so it was really noisy. So if you are looking for that peaceful, quiet experience, make sure to ask that, because a lot of Bali is constantly undergoing more development. And the other really important question to ask, especially if you're booking an Airbnb, is are you going to be expected to pay for electricity throughout your stay? For me, probably because I was staying for a longer period of time, the answer to that was yes. And I actually had to fill the energy meter a couple of different times throughout my stay, and also had to pay for water. So just make sure you get clear expectations so you know what to expect there. But let's talk about some of those things that you probably want to pack before your trip, because you might have a hard time finding them in Bali. So the first thing is flip-flops. I made the mistake of thinking that, hey, I'm not going to travel with flip-flops. I'm just going to buy some when I get there. And turns out all the flip-flops were way too small, and I don't have particularly large feet. I had to try like 7-8 different places before I found a pair of flip-flops that actually fit. So yeah, don't make that mistake. The next thing to note is that I actually constantly found myself in long sleeve t-shirts. You're constantly in the sun in Bali, so it was really helpful to have that very light long sleeve t-shirt. And then if I was going to a place like Monkey Forest, I had an extra layer of protection between me and the monkeys, and we'll get to that later. But another thing to note is that this probably isn't the destination where you need to overpack a ton, because laundry services are so accessible, and the people are wonderful. It's a really efficient service, very affordable, and just, yeah, great overall. So skip the big bag with all of the clothes, bring just what you need, and rely on doing laundry here, because it really is a good experience. But the last thing that you definitely do want to pack is sunscreen. Yes, you can definitely buy sunscreen in Bali, but it comes at a premium cost. So if you are looking to save some dollars, definitely make sure to bring some bottles of sunscreen from wherever you're traveling from. Now, let's talk about some of those general tips that people always have questions about. And one thing that I always get asked is, what about Bali belly? How sick am I going to get? How can I avoid it? How bad is it? And yes, Bali belly is a real thing. I've heard that it is a terrible experience, but luckily I did not get Bali belly, and I think I can attribute that to really three main things. I didn't drink the tap water. I always wash my hands before eating, and I read reviews before eating at a restaurant. And that was really all I did, and that was more than enough. So yes, it is something that might happen to you, but I think if you take those general precautions, you should be all right. Another one that I always get asked about is the bum gun. And I'm not gonna go in depth on the bum gun, but sometimes when you walk into a restroom, you're not going to find toilet paper, but there will always be this reliable little hose right next to the toilet, and I'll let your imagination run wild as to how you use it. But yes, the bum gun is a very real thing. It's a unique experience, so have fun with that. Another thing to note is that this is a place where you should carry a little bit more cash. If you are renting the scooters, a lot of the times you are going to have to pay for parking, and those are always going to be basically cash and very small bills. So it's definitely good to have those on hand, so keep that in mind. And another question that I get a lot is, what about Monkey Forest up in Ubud? Is it worth it? Is it safe? Should I do it? And the answer is yes. It is definitely worth it. It is a really unique experience. Do note that it is a bit commercialized. You're not going to be like completely out in the wilderness. No, there are going to be lots of people and people that work there. Yes, the monkeys can be dangerous if you're not using common sense. These are wild animals. Don't look the monkeys in the eye. Don't show your teeth at them. And this is where having those long sleeve t-shirts really come in handy, because it provides that extra layer of protection between you and the monkey, because you definitely don't want to get bit or scratched. Now let's talk about some of those biggest mistakes that I think a lot of tourists make, and it really ends up skewing their perspective of Bali and sometimes ruins their trip. So the first thing that I think is really important to note is it's important to have realistic expectations. Bali is one of those places that gets glamorized on social media, and I get that. I guess I'm part of that. It's a weird relationship doing this whole thing, but I think for me, one of the expectations that I had that was just wrong was I thought Bali was going to be this huge culture shock, this really cool like immersion of a new culture. And while it can be that, I'd say for the vast majority of tourists, they end up getting sucked into these little bubbles around the tourist areas that really do a wonderful job catering to the tourists and making trips convenient, but you don't get immersed in the culture like social media will lead you to believe. So be prepared for that, and be prepared to have to push out a bit if you are looking for that. Next tip kind of bleeds into that, having realistic expectations, which is with prices. Well, yes, Bali is still a very affordable travel destination. It is not as dirt cheap as it once was, and some of the prices, especially for accommodation, have skyrocketed. And that kind of leads to this next really important tip, which is recognize that there's a very real pain being felt by some of the locals. And a lot of that is because of the over-tourism that is happening. With the rise in tourism, prices and affordability in general has just kind of been inaccessible for the locals, and many of them have been pushed out of the areas that they once lived. If you want to learn more about that and want to hear just kind of my unfiltered, unedited perspective of what it was like living in Bali, you can watch this video right here where I do that. Or if you want to know what I loved and hated about Bali, you can watch that right here. I hope all this was helpful, and we'll catch you guys next time.